Welcome to another unit in this course on economics. This time I'm going to talk about the labor market, how we can model the labor market, and which insights we can draw from this market diagram of a labor market. Here we have the standard approach of describing the labor market graphically. We have labor demand and labor supply, with one addition in this context, that labor we talk about here is actually the labor provided by the workers to the companies. So it's not about the jobs, it's not the job market, it's really the labor market. And for this reason, the households are actually the suppliers of labor, and the companies are the demanders for labor. Because the workers work, so they supply their work to the market. The companies need the work, so they demand the work. Then, down here as quantity, we have the amount of work offered or traded, and the price for work, which here is nothing else than the real wage rate. And well, this is basically it about the labor market, with one small addition to go, and that's here the equilibrium point A with the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Well, the equilibrium in the labor market, that's also called full employment. That's a term we will see in a few slides as well again. And full employment does not mean everyone is employed. It simply means everyone that at the current wage rate wants to work will also find work. That's a small difference here, because it does not preclude unemployment. It just precludes involuntary unemployment. So it's still possible that we have voluntary unemployment even though we have full employment, officially speaking. Well, usually this unemployment rate is relatively small, so usually you go with around 2 to 3 or maybe 4%, but nothing more. So that's about full employment. Well, that's the labor market diagram we're going to work with. However, the reality might look slightly different. That's actually here an alternative, which looks like this. Meaning, first off, with the labor demand, even though there might be very little labor available, we might still need something. So we're not going to touch the zero curve here. We need some, and if there's very little available, we might be willing to pay very high prices for it. On the other hand, this part down here means that the wage will never drop to zero. So that would be an ideal labor demand curve. The labor supply curve looks even stranger, looks like an inverted S curve. The shape comes from the fact that at some point down here, your wage is so small that you can barely afford living. In this context, we need to mention that this basic model precludes something like Social Security. So without Social Security, this would be like the point where you can barely survive living. And if your wage decreases even further, you have to start working more again, else you cannot afford living. So even though your wage decreases, you will work more to at least allow yourself to survive. That's why here we have this band. On the other hand, up here, you earn so much money that supposedly you have to work a lot for this, that you decide, if you get a wage raise, to no longer increase your working hours, but instead start using the money you have and increase your free time. Because, well, the overall amount of money you earn stays the same, but now you have more time available to actually spend it. That's the idea here. So the extreme situations only work either in the case of very, very low income or very, very high income. So the normal thing is still positively increasing here, but not necessarily monotonously. So that's a more realistic situation. However, you might imagine this is pretty problematic in getting any decent insights from a market diagram like this. That's why we're going to abandon this more realistic approach in favor of the easier to work with linear approach. That was the one from the slide before. Okay, so we have the basic approach of the labor market. So what happens if we have shifts in supply and demand? Let's start with some examples which might actually impact labor supply. Well, we said labor supply, that's the workers. That's the people supplying their labor force. So this means if we have more or less workers available, we will get a shift in labor supply. And an ideal example for this is migration in both directions. Could be immigration or emigration. With immigration, the amount of available workers will increase. So the labor supply will shift to the right. The equilibrium will move from up here down here. So we will have a pressure on the wage rate. So the wages might drop because there are more workers available. On the other hand, we will have an overall increase in the amount of work being done. That's the part here. On the other hand, if we have emigration, we are losing workers. And well, there's always this trade-off. If in one country we have immigration, in the other country we have emigration. So here, the labor supply will decrease. So the curve will move to the left. We'll get a new equilibrium to the upper left, meaning we would have higher wages, lower labor being produced or being supplied, meaning with lower labor we also will get a lower GDP. So that's the effect in the country sending the migrants. That's the effect in the country receiving the migrants. So that's one idea which might affect a change in labor supply. Another effect might simply by an increase in population. So population growth, positive population growth, might actually have the same effect as immigration. We'll have a positive effect on labor supply, giving us this new equilibrium. On the other hand, a negative population growth or something like an aging society will have a negative effect on labor supply because, well, even though there might be some people there, they are no longer in working age, so they will leave the labor force, which also means we have a decrease in labor supply because the labor supply, that's not the amount of people in a country, that's the amount of people who can and will work in a country. Okay, so we see we have different aspects which can be discussed in this context. One of those aspects is migration. The other is the whole discussion of population growth, of demographic change, which can also be discussed in this context, and the effects thereof can be discussed. However, labor supply is not the only thing to consider here. We can also consider changes in labor demand. One classical effect here is if we consider crises or phases of economic growth. In a crisis, actually companies might shut down or go with shorter working hours. So in either case, they need less workers or workers working less. So we have a decrease in labor demand. So the labor demand curve shifts to the left, meaning fewer people working, meaning higher possible unemployment, lower GDP, and lower wages. On the other hand, if we have a phase of economic growth, we will get more people working, higher GDPs, and higher wages, because people become scarcer, labor becomes scarcer, so it becomes more valuable. So that's also one effect to consider here. Everything related to economic growth or decline, and all the effects linked to this. So whatever actually pushes economic growth, so in other words, all the other factors of the production function, especially knowledge innovations, will have an effect on labor demand. Actually, innovation can have two effects. Can have a growth effect, increasing labor demand, can also have a negative effect on labor demand if we talk about process innovations, for example. So that's actually a very tricky question, and we really need to go into detail which effect will happen here. But in general, we could say all changes in production factors, well, except for labor itself, will have an effect on labor demand. Okay, so we talked about movements of this supply and demand curve. However, let's consider a different question. That's what if the market price in the labor market, so the wages in the labor market, are larger than the equilibrium would actually dictate. Well, in this case, we would actually have a problem and we would get unemployment. And not just any type of unemployment, we would get involuntary unemployment. I just earlier said here in the situation of full employment, we would still have unemployment, but voluntary unemployment. This unemployment here would be involuntary. People want to work, but companies do not want to employ as many people due to the higher labor costs. So for this wage, more people want to work than are actually asked for. Well, once we have raised the question of unemployment, we can actually discuss different types of unemployment. And I try to order this by the duration, which is more or less assumed for this type of unemployment. Therefore, the shortest type of unemployment, or the really short-term unemployment, is what we might call frictional or surge unemployment. That's like unemployment between two jobs. So you quit job number one, but have to wait like 1 month before you can start job number two. Or you finish school, you cannot directly go to university, but also doesn't make sense to start a job for 1 month. That's frictional unemployment. You finish university, can start your job only 2 months later. That's again frictional unemployment. So it's usually only a few months. So it's short-term unemployment. Also still short-term, but from a different perspective, and in particular of a cyclical type, so it's always returning in the same fashion, so-called seasonal unemployment. That's like people who only have a job during certain periods of the year, but not necessarily, especially not in the same type of work during the rest of the year. That's called seasonal unemployment because they are unemployed in specific seasons, in specific time periods in the year, but it's always the same time periods. Also of a cyclical nature, but more or less of a medium-term duration, so-called business cycle unemployment. Business cycle unemployment in some cases also refer to just cyclical unemployment. This means people losing jobs during an economic downturn, during a recession and a depression phase, but then being re-employed during economic upturn during a boom phase. So here we have phases of higher and lower employment and unemployment. However, a critical point to mention in this context is that a lot of people not necessarily find a new job in the same field where they actually lost their old jobs, because usually in the primary and secondary sector, jobs are cancelled, abolished during an economic downturn, but new jobs are formed or found only in the high-tech secondary or in the tertiary sector. So that might also be a problem, especially if you do not want to start in a sector you do not know for usually a way lower wage than before. And this then could lead to structural or long-term unemployment. Whereas structural unemployment is slightly more different, but only slightly, because this focuses mostly on the structural effects. So it's not necessarily always a consequence of business cycle unemployment, but it can be if the business cycle is also related to structural change. So for example, if you've been working in mining for a long time, then mining is phased out and only new jobs in marketing are found. So it's pretty hard to switch from being a miner to working in marketing. So the fact that some jobs are just phased out might lead to long-term unemployment, which here is called structural unemployment. And also, usually a consequence of structural unemployment is what is called hardcore unemployment, whereas the idea is we always generate like a core unemployment, which even though we might have an economic upturn later on, cannot fully be recovered. So there's always some people left behind which cannot yet be integrated or reintegrated into the labor market again. And that's what's called hardcore unemployment, or in some cases also referred to as natural unemployment level. Finally, we have the so-called hidden unemployment. That's people who might be unemployed, but who do not register as unemployed and thereby are not part of the unemployment statistics. For example, there's super rich people. They have a lot of money, they don't need to work, but they don't go to the unemployment agency and register as unemployed. So that's a second type of unemployment, or not the classical type of unemployment. Well, aside from these types of unemployment, we could even have the exact opposite problem. We can have a shortage of labor, which usually results from a situation where the wage is too low or perceived to be too low. Because then for this wage, less people want to work than are wanted by the companies. And this in some fields is also a problem for some countries, especially in fields like the mint area or in healthcare. There's usually relatively low wages, a high amount of work to be done. So in most cases, this goes hand in hand with a shortage of workers in this area. So similarly to the unemployment issue, this is a problem relating to the wage policies. And in this context, it makes sense to actually discuss some types of wage policy. And the most well-known of them are something like minimum wage policies, social security, but also something like the discussion surrounding the base income or something like union wages. Because all of them have one thing in common: they determine some kind of lower bound to the income. So the wage rate cannot drop below the set level. Well, if it cannot drop below the set level, there are actually two possibilities. Either, for example, the minimum wage, if we take this as an example, is down here. Well, in this case, the equilibrium will be established, which is higher in wages than a minimum wage. So minimum wage in this context will have no effect whatsoever. This would be like if you establish a minimum wage for CEOs and say every CEO should earn at least 10 euros per hour. well, this actually wouldn't make any sense. No one would actually be affected by this. However, it might be a problem if the equilibrium price is below the minimum wage, or below social security rates, or below union rates. Because in this case, the wage rate is actually pushed upwards, having the effect that companies want to employ less people for this pushed price than people want to work for, and we get involuntary unemployment. And that's something we might have seen in a lot of examples. That's not necessarily always the case. There are some very, very few examples to this, but in most cases, this could actually happen if we have a sector where the equilibrium wage is actually relatively low. So this is a problem in particular for unskilled workers, because there the equilibrium prices are usually in the lower area. So here it's relatively easy for the minimum wage to be above this equilibrium wage level. And well, that was my final comment regarding the labor market. Different aspects to be discussed in the context of the labor market. So I hope you enjoyed this session. I say goodbye and see you next time.